Scary Deep Woods Stories, The Whispering House Curse. It began on a gray October morning when Caleb Myers, a 34-year-old photojournalist known for chasing stories in forgotten corners of America, received a letter in the mail with no return address, no stamp, just his name scrawled in uneven block letters and inside a single sheet of brittle yellowed paper with one sentence written in typewriter font. They never left the house on Bramble Lane. Find them before it's too late. And though Caleb had no memory of anyone ever mentioning Bramble Lane, something in his gut shifted uneasily, as if a distant childhood nightmare had stirred beneath the surface of his mind. So he began to dig, curious, skeptical, yet drawn in by the mystery like a moth circling too close to the flame. And within a few hours of researching through old newspaper archives and online local forums, he discovered that Bramble Lane was a dead-end road outside a small town in Maine called Wickridge, a town so tiny it barely existed on modern maps. But more disturbingly, the only notable event associated with that road was the 1963 disappearance of the entire Wendell family, a father, mother, two daughters, and a housekeeper who were last seen entering their new home at number 104 Bramble Lane and never seen again. The police found no bodies, no signs of struggle, not even fingerprints on the doorknobs. Just dinner left untouched on the table, water running in the upstairs bathroom, and an old phonograph softly spinning a record of Bach's cello suites on repeat in the living room. And though rumors spread of a cult sacrifice or secret escape, the case was quietly closed due to lack of evidence, written off as a mass disappearance with no suspects or leads. And the house had since passed through 5 different owners in 5 decades, each of whom either died, vanished, or abandoned the property within weeks of moving in, until it was ultimately left to rot, boarded up and forgotten, yet still legally owned by a distant relative who refused to sell or demolish it for unknown reasons. And this was the story Caleb wanted, no, needed to chase, not just for his blog, but for himself, because the deeper he dug, the more fragments of his own forgotten memories surfaced. A wooden staircase with peeling red paint, the sound of humming from behind a wall, and a pale girl with hollow eyes whispering something he could never fully remember. So he packed his camera, his recorder, a flashlight, and enough supplies for a week and drove north for nearly 9 hours through the winding, tree-lined highways until the GPS signal dropped and the sky turned an unsettling shade of ash gray just as he reached the outskirts of Wickridge, where time seemed suspended in 1971. The gas stations still had analog pumps, the diners had jukeboxes in every booth, and everyone stared at him with wary, slow-moving eyes as he stopped for directions at a dusty convenience store, where an old man behind the counter simply shook his head and muttered, "Don't go up, Bramble Lane. Son, that house ain't right, never was," before refusing to say anything else. So naturally, Caleb pressed on, his curiosity now ignited into a blazing obsession, and after another 10 minutes of driving through unmarked roads, he saw the rusted street sign that read Bramble Lane, twisted sideways as if it had tried to escape, and at the end of the road stood the house, 3 stories tall, Victorian, once beautiful but now wrapped in creeping ivy and cloaked in a shroud of silence so thick it felt like standing underwater. And despite the overcast sky and midday hour, the windows reflected no light, only blackness. And though every fiber of Caleb's being screamed at him to stay in the car, he stepped out, his boots crunching on gravel and broken glass as he approached the rotting porch, each step groaning beneath his weight like a reluctant sigh. And when he reached the front door, the air hit him like a slap, cold, stale, but tinged with the faint scent of perfume and mold, as if the house had preserved the last breath of the people who once lived there. And he whispered, "Hello," into the silence, his voice instantly swallowed by the oppressive stillness. And as he moved room to room, photographing everything, he noticed how untouched it all felt. The furniture was still in place, photos still hung crookedly on the walls, dishes still in the sink, but everything covered in decades of dust, as though time had stopped the moment they vanished. And then he heard it. A soft shuffle from upstairs, unmistakably human. And though he should have turned and left right then, He slowly climbed the staircase, camera in hand, heart pounding. And the sound grew louder, footsteps pacing back and forth behind a closed bedroom door at the end of the hall. And when he reached for the knob, it turned freely, revealing an empty room with a rocking chair swaying slightly, as if someone had just stood up, and a child's drawing taped to the wall of a stick figure family all standing outside a tall house. Except the figures had no faces and black scribbles where their eyes should be, and below it, written in shaky crayon, "She watches through the walls." And Caleb stepped back, the temperature dropping rapidly as the room seemed to exhale around him. And then the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls, and his camera blinked red. Battery dead, though it was fully charged just hours ago. And the windows wouldn't open, the door wouldn't budge. And then came the voice, soft, childlike, female, from the corner of the room behind the rocking chair, whispering, "You saw me before, remember? You were here too." And Caleb spun around but saw no one, only shadows that shifted just out of reach. And as he pounded on the walls, a section of wallpaper tore loose, revealing something horrific underneath. Hundreds of tiny fingernail scratches dug into the drywall, as if someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. And suddenly the room groaned, the walls vibrating with a low hum like chanting just beneath the surface. And a second voice joined the first, deeper, male, more guttural, whispering from inside the vent. "They never left, and neither will you." And at that moment the light bulb overhead exploded, plunging Caleb into darkness as something cold and wet brushed his arm. And then the whispering grew louder, dozens of voices rising into a chorus of sorrow, rage, and pleading. And just before he lost consciousness, he saw through the crack in the floorboard below his feet, an eye staring back at him, unblinking, and filled with a hunger that no living thing could possess. Caleb woke in the dark with the taste of copper in his mouth and the stench of mildew filling his nostrils, his limbs aching and stiff as though he had been lying in place for days. But when he checked his watch, it was only 2 hours since he had entered the house, and his first thought was to escape, to get out and drive as far as he could. But the moment he stood up, something shifted in the walls, like an animal crawling through the bones of the house, and he realized with a growing sense of dread that the front door no longer existed. Where it once had been was now a seamless wall of faded wallpaper, as if the house had closed its mouth and swallowed the exit whole. And when he ran to the back of the house, it was the same, windows sealed shut with thick, ancient glass that refused to break no matter how hard he struck it with the iron poker he found in the cold fireplace. And all the while, the whispers returned, not loud or aggressive, but insistent, muttering from floorboards, from vents, from beneath the radiator, saying his name over and over like a prayer. And at first he tried to reason with it, to speak aloud to whatever presence was in the house, asking what it wanted, who it was, but no answer came. Only a high-pitched giggle from the shadows of the hallway, the unmistakable sound of a child's voice repeating, "You came back, you came back, you came back." And when he turned to confront it, he caught only the briefest glimpse of a small, pale figure darting around the corner, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And when he chased after it, the house twisted around him, halls lengthening impossibly, doors multiplying, and behind every door he opened, there was a room that made no logical sense, a dining room where the ceiling dripped blood in slow, deliberate drops onto a feast of rotting meat with chairs that rocked on their own, a bathroom filled from floor to ceiling with stagnant water, a woman's face barely visible floating beneath the surface with eyes wide and mouth frozen in a scream, a nursery with mobiles made of teeth and bones spinning gently above a cradle that held only a bundle of hair tied with twine. And each time he entered and then exited one of these rooms, he found himself in a part of the house he didn't recognize, as if it rearranged itself behind him like a living maze, feeding on his confusion, and his camera refused to turn on. The flashlight flickered and died despite new batteries, and the only thing that worked was the audio recorder, which picked up voices even when the room was silent, including one that whispered, "She's watching you from behind your eyes." And he began to doubt his own sanity, wondering if he was hallucinating, if maybe the letter had been bait sent by someone who knew he had stayed at a psychiatric facility as a teenager for a brief period of night terrors, a fact he had buried deep but was now clawing back into his mind with razor-tipped fingers, and he remembered something he had not thought of in decades, a vision he used to draw compulsively as a child, a house with a single black window, and inside that window, a face without skin staring out. And that same image now appeared carved into the wooden floor at his feet, etched by thousands of tiny scratches, like fingernails dragged in desperation. And he realized with a sickening twist that the Wendell family had not simply vanished. They had been consumed, absorbed, and repurposed by the house into echoes, memories, fragments trapped in a loop, and that he too was becoming a part of it, his voice growing fainter in his own ears. Ears, his reflection in the mirror not quite matching his movements. And he began to notice that when he closed his eyes, he could still see the house. Not just the rooms he'd entered, but others, darker ones, far below the surface, filled with things that crawled and wept and waited. And then came the dreams. If they could be called dreams, visions of blackened staircases spiraling downward into screaming mouths, of dolls stitched together with human skin, whispering secrets in Latin, of a man in a wide-brimmed hat standing just outside the window, holding a lantern made of bone. And in every dream he was running, but the house always caught him, dragging him back with invisible hands and walls that pulsed like lungs. And when he woke each time, he wasn't sure how long he'd slept, what day it was, or if time even existed anymore, because the clocks were all wrong, ticking backward or not at all. And outside the windows there was nothing. No sky, no trees, just a thick gray fog pressing against the glass like a hungry mouth. And he began to forget things, small things at first, like the name of his editor, the color of his car, but then bigger things, his own last name, where he was born, the voice of his mother, and the house seemed to feed on these losses, growing louder, more confident, its whispers becoming commands. Dig, listen, bleed, become. And one day he found himself in the attic, though he had no memory of climbing the stairs, standing before a wall with symbols drawn in soot and blood, and a small square hole in the floor beneath his feet that exhaled warm breath upward. And from the hole came a voice he remembered from childhood, the same voice that had once told him to hold his breath until the shadows went away, the same voice that told him the real world was just a dream and the house was truth. And he looked down and saw a face staring back. His own face, but older, gaunt, with eyes hollowed out and stitched shut. And the other him whispered, "Let go!" And something inside him broke. And he screamed until the sound cracked the silence like glass. And suddenly the attic door slammed shut, and the walls began to bleed from every seam, dark red liquid oozing across the floor. And the ceiling buckled downward as if the house itself were collapsing inward. And then everything went black again. And he awoke in the basement, chained to the wall, the air thick with rot and the sound of someone breathing in the darkness. And a light flickered on, an old hanging bulb swinging slowly. And across from him sat a child, no more than 6, skin translucent, eyes wide and dead, wearing a dress from the 1960s and holding a broken doll. And she smiled and said, "I remember you, Caleb. You were here before. We all were." And behind her stood others, dozens of them, children, adults, all gray and hollow. And they spoke in unison, "Join us." And he realized they weren't ghosts. They were impressions, imprints of souls the house had digested and reassembled like a scrapbook of suffering. And then came the door in the floor, opening slowly, revealing a staircase carved into raw earth, descending into a darkness that pulsed and breathed and whispered in languages older than thought. And he knew then that the real heart of the house wasn't in the rooms above. It was down there, buried deep, waiting for him. And as the chains fell away on their own, and he stepped toward the door, the whispering stopped, replaced by silence so complete it rang in his ears. And with one final breath, he descended, not knowing if he would ever come back. The staircase into the earth seemed to stretch far beyond any human architecture, not crafted by tools or men, but shaped by pressure, time, and something far older than the house above it, something primal, something alive. And Caleb felt it immediately as he stepped onto the first slick stone stair. The temperature dropped so low his breath came out in clouds, yet beads of sweat formed on his skin, as if the air around him were thick with fever. And the silence was unbearable, not just quiet, but an utter absence of sound. Like his ears had been sealed, and even his heartbeat dulled in his chest, as though the house had reached inside and slowed it to match its own rhythm. But he kept going, his feet moving without conscious decision, as if compelled by a rope tied to his soul. Down and down and down, the air growing heavier, the light behind him from the attic bulb shrinking until there was only darkness. And when he tried to turn back, the stairs behind him were gone, dissolved into the black, and a faint red glow flickered far below, pulsing like the beat of some unseen heart. And as he descended, the walls pressed closer, dirt and stone leaking dark fluid. And from time to time he saw faces embedded in the walls, screaming, weeping, some with mouths sewn shut, some with their eyes wide in agony. And though he tried not to look, he realized they were familiar, not from life, but from the photographs in the Wendell House upstairs. Family portraits warped and faded, now reflected in the walls as if the house had claimed them, stored them here, preserved their torment. And he passed one final step and entered a chamber so vast it defied logic. A cathedral beneath the earth with no visible walls or ceiling, just black void pierced by a blood-red light, glowing from a circle carved into the floor, pulsing in time with a deep thrum that vibrated through his bones. And in the center of that circle stood a figure, tall, robed in what looked like strands of hair and dried flesh, its face obscured by a mask that resembled a human skull, twisted sideways. And when it turned toward him, he heard not a voice but a presence fill his head, whispering in a language not meant for human tongues, a language that slid behind his eyes and wrapped itself around his memories. And suddenly he was not in the cavern anymore. He was back in the Wendell house, but it was alive, the walls pulsing like lungs, the lights flickering like blood vessels. And people moved through the halls with no eyes, no mouths, walking in endless circles, whispering fragments of lives they could no longer remember. And he was one of them, his hands no longer his own, his voice gone, his memories dissolving like fog. And just as the last piece of his identity began to slip away, he snapped back to the cavern, gasping on his knees, the figure still watching him with no eyes. And he realized this being was the core of the house, its heart, its creator, or its prisoner. He couldn't tell, only that it wanted him. It wanted everyone. And behind it rose a structure, a kind of altar piled with bones shaped into a throne. And nailed to that throne was what remained of Edward Wendell, or something like him, a husk twitching slightly as if still aware. His mouth open in a silent scream, eyes hollow, skin stretched thin like paper. And Caleb screamed too, but no sound came, and the red light flared brighter, flooding the chamber, and a door opened in the space beside him. Not a door of wood, but a tear in reality itself, revealing another place, another house, identical to the one he had entered, but in a different state, newer, untouched, filled with life. And through it he saw himself, a younger version, sitting in a car, reading the letter. And he realized the house wasn't just feeding, it was looping, trapping people again and again, repeating their torment, creating endless copies, and he had to break it. He had to do something before the door closed. But the figure raised its hand and the vision vanished, replaced by a storm of images flashing before his eyes. Bodies buried in walls, children with mouths full of nails, a woman tearing her own face off while laughing, and beneath it all, a voice, his own, screaming for help, begging to be released. And then he was back in the house, not in the cavern, standing in the hallway outside the basement, holding the letter again, the exact moment he had first stepped through the threshold, and for a moment he believed it was a dream, a hallucination. But then he looked at his hands and they were aged, withered, his fingernails blackened, his skin sagging like wax left too long in the sun. and his reflection in the window showed an older version of himself. Broken, haunted, and in the distance the whispers started again, low and slow, building with every breath. And this time they weren't calling him. They were laughing, mocking, and the house shuddered around him like it was breathing, pleased with its game. And when he tried to run, every door he opened led to the same room, over and over, a bedroom with a rotting crib and a figure under the blanket that twitched violently whenever he approached. And finally, after the 10th or 20th time, he ripped the blanket off and saw himself, eyes stitched shut, mouth stuffed with hair, and he screamed again, and this time the walls screamed back, and something fell from the ceiling, a bundle wrapped in cloth, landing with a sickening wet thud, and when he unwrapped it, he found a tape recorder, one of his old models, caked in blood, the tape inside spinning by itself. And from it came a recording of his own voice whispering, "You are inside now, and inside never ends." And he felt the floor give way, dropping him into blackness once more. And when he opened his eyes, he was strapped to a chair in a room lit by candles made from human fat, and around him stood the Wendell family, not dead, not alive, just watching, their mouths moving but no sound escaping. And then the child, the same one from the attic, stepped forward and placed a mirror in his lap. And in it, he saw not himself, but everyone else the house had claimed. Dozens, hundreds, screaming silently, reaching for him, and the last face he saw was his own mother, pale and eyeless, whispering, "Don't forget who you are." And then the mirror shattered and the whispers grew louder, spinning around him in a vortex of noise and agony. And the walls bent inward, and he understood. This was not a haunting. It was a system, a cycle, a machine designed to devour identity, memory, and soul. And he was now a cog in its gears, just another whisper in the walls, waiting to call the next name. Caleb's consciousness flickered like a dying bulb, each pulse a snapshot of some unbearable reality he could neither escape nor fully comprehend. He was in the chair. Yes, but he was also elsewhere, many places at once. Glimpses of lives and deaths he had never lived but felt as if he had, watching a woman drown her own children in a clawfoot tub before opening her throat with a shard of mirror, reliving a soldier's scream as he clawed at insects beneath his skin while the house whispered in a voice like dry leaves. And in every vision there was the house, its form changing. A plantation in Georgia soaked with blood, a tenement in Chicago echoing with child sobs, a farmhouse in Iowa where the family vanished into the walls. And in each, it consumed, and he understood now this house was no house at all. Not simply wood and nail, but an entity, a consciousness stretching through time and space, wearing architecture like skin, feeding on trauma, pain, memory, and repetition, nesting in locations where sorrow had pooled for centuries. And the Wendell House was only its current face, not the first, certainly not the last, and it wanted him to see this, to feel the enormity of its design, the scope of its hunger, and he screamed but his mouth didn't move, and still the images kept coming. A priest burying a box of bones beneath the church altar, a little boy whispering secrets into a vent before vanishing from his bed, an old woman feeding raw meat to a thing living in her cellar. And then Caleb was in the house again, standing in a hallway that should not exist, its walls lined with photographs that moved, looping silently, people living their last moments over and over, a couple turning on the gas stove and never waking up, a girl dancing in her room before something black dragged her under her bed, and as he moved down the corridor, the wallpaper peeled back in strips, revealing muscle and veins that pulsed with every step. The floorboards groaned not with pressure, but in protest, as if he was walking on the spine of some slumbering beast. And the whispers returned, louder now, more distinct. He could make out names, not just any names but his own, repeated in hundreds of voices, some his own, some belonging to strangers. And when he turned a corner, he saw them. Versions of himself, frozen in different stages of decay, some freshly dead, others little more than bone, all staring with empty sockets, all mouthing his name, and he stumbled back into a door and fell through into the kitchen. Except it wasn't the same kitchen. It was clean, untouched, like a memory, Sunlight streamed through the windows and the smell of cinnamon filled the air. And his mother stood at the stove, humming softly, her back to him, and for one horrifying second he believed he was home, really home, before she turned and her face was gone, just skin stretched smooth where eyes and nose and mouth should be. And he screamed again, but she only reached out and touched his cheek with fingers like candles, soft and melting, and whispered without a mouth, "Stay with me." And suddenly the kitchen burned away and he was outside, standing on the roof of the Wendell house in the middle of a storm, the sky black and swirling with impossible shapes, and lightning illuminated the town below. But it was not the town he remembered. Every house had windows filled with staring eyes. Every tree bent toward him like skeletal hands. And above it all, the Wendell house rose taller and taller, growing by the second, spires and wings spiraling into the storm. And he realized he was no longer a man in a house, but a thought trapped in a god, a memory inside something infinite and cruel. And the wind howled in 1,000 voices, speaking in riddles that stabbed at his sanity. "You built this with grief. You opened the letter. You let it in." And Caleb fell to his knees, clutching his ears, but the voices seeped into his brain like oil through cloth. And he began to see the pattern, the why of it all. The house fed not just on suffering, but on attention, on awareness. And every time someone told its story, read its history, stepped across its threshold with curiosity or dread, it grew stronger, expanded its reach, and by entering it, by witnessing, he had become part of it, another cell in its vast, parasitic body. And the only way out was to sever that connection, to forget, to erase. But even that might not be enough because the house remembered and it would find him again, in sleep, in dreams, in the faces of strangers. And he could already feel it pushing into his thoughts, reshaping his memories, replacing the faces of his family with those from the photos on the walls, replacing his voice with the whispers, replacing his will with its own. And he fell forward into darkness once more, only to wake in a hospital bed, sunlight filtering through sterile blinds, an IV in his arm, and a nurse scribbling notes beside him. And for one brief, dazzling moment, he thought he had escaped. But then he noticed the pattern on the wallpaper. Subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable. The same twisting black vine motif from the Wendell hallway. And he looked at the nurse and saw her eyes were all pupil, black and bottomless. And she leaned down and whispered in his ear, "You never left." And the room blinked out like a candle snuffed in wind. And he was back in the attic, the letter in his hand. Everything as it had been on the first day. Except this time the voice came immediately, whispering from the walls from inside his skull. "Again!" And Caleb laughed, not because it was funny, but because he had nothing left. No weapons, no escape, just the endless loop, the eternal house. And behind the laughter he heard something else. The sound of another car pulling up outside, another soul answering the call. And he knew what came next because he would be waiting, standing at the window, watching them walk up the path, and he would greet them and offer them the letter and speak the words the house had taught him. "Welcome. I've been expecting you." The sound of the car door slamming echoed through the corridors of the Wendell house like a gunshot in a tomb. And somewhere deep within the decaying framework, something stirred with interest, something that had waited through centuries of silence, slumbering only when no minds were near to feed upon, but now awake again, alert, hungry. And as Caleb stood motionless at the top of the stairs, watching through the cracked lace curtains, he could feel it humming beneath his skin, a low-frequency vibration in his bones like distant thunder. And the newcomer, a woman in her late 20s with short dark hair and cautious eyes, stepped cautiously onto the overgrown path, her boots crunching dead leaves, a camera hanging around her neck, a leather satchel bouncing at her hip. And when she reached the porch, she paused, glancing up at the windows as if sensing the gaze on her. And Caleb, if he could still be called that, opened the door before she could knock, smiling with a face that no longer felt entirely his. The expression learned, rehearsed, as though he had practiced it 1,000 times. And when she asked if this was the Wendell property, he nodded and replied, "Come in, I've been expecting you." And the words felt both foreign and inevitable in his mouth, like a prophecy spoken not by will, but by design. And as she stepped across the threshold, the house seemed to inhale, the air thickening around her, and Caleb watched as her eyes flicked upward toward the chandelier, the cobwebs, the peeling wallpaper, and he could tell she saw only what it allowed her to see, for now. And he offered her tea, motioned toward the living room, and as they sat, she explained her name was Mara, a paranormal documentarian working on a project about haunted American homes, though her voice trembled when she admitted that this house had called to her, somehow, appearing in her dreams night after night, until she traced its address from an old news clipping about a series of disappearances and a fire that consumed half the structure decades ago. Though she noted with visible confusion that there was no evidence of fire damage now, and Caleb only nodded, offering no explanation, because there was none that would make sense outside the house's own reality. And as Mara set up her equipment, pointing the camera toward the hearth, Caleb excused himself, retreating into the hallway where the walls pulsed gently, approvingly, and he whispered to them, asking if this one would be different, if she would escape, if the cycle would be broken. But the house gave no answer, only the whispering of countless voices layered upon one another like waves on the shore. And when he returned, Mara had begun to ask questions about the architecture, about the Wendell family, about the history of the land. But each time he tried to answer, the words came out wrong, rearranged, manipulated, as though his memories had been rewritten with the house's version of events. And when he mentioned the name Edith Wendell, the air grew colder and Mara's camera flickered briefly, capturing a silhouette behind her that neither of them saw in real time. And later, when reviewing the footage, she would freeze the frame and stare in horror at the figure, a woman with hollow eyes and a rope around her neck, standing just over her shoulder. And by then, it would be far too late. But for now, Mara pressed on, drawn deeper into the mystery. And when she asked to see the attic, Caleb hesitated, a flicker of his old self screaming inside his skull to warn her, to stop her. But the house's grip was too tight now, and so he nodded and led her upstairs, each step creaking underfoot like a groan of protest. And as they reached the attic door, the knob turned on its own, slowly, and Mara looked at Caleb with wide eyes. But he only opened the door wider, gesturing her through, and when she stepped inside, the attic was dark but not empty, filled with mirrors, hundreds of them, of all shapes and sizes, none reflecting their own images, but showing other scenes. A hospital room, a funeral, a child screaming in a locked closet, and Mara gasped, backing away. But the door slammed shut behind her, and Caleb remained outside, listening as her breathing quickened, as the mirrors began to hum, and one by one her reflections began to show her things. Her dead brother crawling from a river, her mother screaming in an asylum, her own face splitting open to reveal worms. And she screamed, slamming the lens cap onto her camera. But the house would not let her leave, not yet, and Caleb fell to his knees outside the door, torn between the house's will and the last scraps of his conscience. But the voices whispered, soothing him, promising clarity, purpose, eternity, and he surrendered once more, and the attic fell silent. And hours later, when the door opened again, Mara stepped out, her face pale, her eyes dull, as though something inside her had cracked and spilled, and she whispered, "I remember everything." And Caleb nodded solemnly, because they all said that at some point, and the next day, Mara stayed, claiming she needed to study the house further, setting up cameras in every room. But they all failed within minutes, the footage becoming distorted, twisted with images that were not from this reality, rooms that didn't exist, faces she didn't recognize, herself walking through the hallways in clothes she'd never worn, speaking in tongues. And she documented everything obsessively, filling notebooks with sketches and dates and diagrams. And Caleb watched her descend into the same mania he had once known. And when she finally begged him to take her to the basement, he refused at first because that was the one place even he feared, the place where the heart of the house beat loudest. But she persisted, and so he relented, guiding her down the narrow stairs into the cold stone cellar, where the walls wept and the lights flickered red, and at the far end was the sealed door, an ancient slab of oak bound with iron bands and covered in symbols from a dozen forgotten languages. And Mara reached out, touching one glyph, and screamed as her hand burned, blistered, but she did not pull away, and the door pulsed like flesh and opened just a crack, and from within came a sound, a baby crying, a man laughing, 1,000 whispers, all speaking her name, and she collapsed, convulsing, and Caleb dragged her out. But her eyes rolled back and her mouth foamed, and he knew she had seen too much too soon, and she would not last, not unless the house wanted her to. And this time it did not, because by morning she was gone, her room empty, her notes burned to ash. The camera melted into the floorboards, and Caleb only stared at the mirror in the hallway, which now showed Mara standing in the attic, eyes wide, mouth sewn shut, trapped forever in the glass like all the others. And he turned away, returning to the window, because another car had arrived, and the cycle would begin again. The morning sun filtered through the filthy curtains with a sickly yellow light that gave no warmth and cast long, quivering shadows across the wooden floorboards of the Wendell House. And Caleb, standing rigidly at the same window he always returned to, watched as a dusty blue pickup truck rolled slowly up the gravel drive, tires crunching against ancient stones that had not shifted for decades, and he felt the house twitch in anticipation, an invisible ripple that ran through its bones and into his spine. And when the truck came to a stop, a man stepped out, mid-30s, denim jacket, scruffy beard, wariness etched deep into the furrows of his brow, as if life had already taught him the price of trust. And behind him came a girl, perhaps 13 or 14, her eyes too alert, too knowing, and it was the child who turned toward the house first, staring up at the eaves as though she could hear the voices already. And Caleb felt an uninvited thought surge to the front of his mind. She sees it, and it made his breath catch in his throat, because the house did not always reveal itself so easily, especially not to children. But this one, this girl, was different. And when the man whose name Caleb would soon learn was James Holloway knocked on the door, Caleb opened it immediately, offering his now customary smile, the one that felt increasingly like a mask that barely clung to the shape of a man he once was. And James introduced himself tersely, saying he was looking for temporary lodging, that he'd inherited a piece of land nearby and needed a place for him and his daughter while they sorted through legal documents and estate sales. And Caleb, speaking words that came not from his own will, but from the whispered insistence of the house, said there was space enough here and that the house was always looking for new stories. And though James hesitated, frowning, the girl, whose name was Lucy, stepped inside without a word, her eyes sweeping the room with a strange mixture of fear and recognition. And the door shut behind them with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and the house settled, satisfied for the moment. And for the first few days, nothing overtly wrong occurred. No slamming doors, no bleeding walls, no whispers in the vents. But Lucy watched the mirrors, and sometimes the mirrors watched back. And when James worked on his laptop in the parlor, researching deeds and land surveys, Lucy would wander the halls, stopping to press her ear to walls where no sound should exist, and asking Caleb strange questions like, did someone ever drown in the cellar? Or why does the attic smell like burned sugar? And Caleb, bound by forces he's only half understood, answered her with evasive truths and partial lies. But it became clear that Lucy wasn't asking out of childish curiosity. She was remembering something, as if she had been here before, and the house grew restless under her gaze, as though offended by her awareness. And on the fourth night, James woke screaming from a dream in which he had watched himself nail shut Lucy's mouth as she stared at him with betrayal in her eyes. And when he turned on the light, he found his own hands trembling, splinters embedded in his palms. And Lucy stood silently at the doorway, whispering, "It's showing you now." And though she would not elaborate, Caleb knew that meant the house had begun its feeding, its probing, and soon James would no longer be able to tell what was dream and what was real, and that was how the house did it. Never sudden, never all at once, but like rot in the floorboards, slow and unnoticed until the collapse came without warning. And over the next few days, James became increasingly paranoid, snapping at Lucy when she touched the walls, unplugging the mirrors, insisting that Caleb tell him who else lived in the house because he heard voices at night and saw shadows in the corners. But Caleb only responded with calm lies that didn't quite cover the truth, and the house allowed him that illusion, as it always did, until the illusion shattered. And it shattered when Lucy disappeared for 5 hours one morning, vanishing without a trace. And when she returned, she had aged. Caleb could see it in her eyes, the way children sometimes do after seeing something they were never meant to understand. And she told her father she had met the lady upstairs. And James, already unbalanced, demanded to know who she meant. And when Lucy pointed at the mirror hanging crookedly in the hallway, James ripped it from the wall and smashed it on the floor. But beneath the shards was not wood or plaster, but another surface. Cold, black, glassy. And when he touched it, it rippled. And from within came a sound like breathing. And then a hand, pale and thin, reached up from the floor and grasped his wrist, pulling hard. And he screamed, stumbling backward, dragging Lucy with him as they fled the hallway. And Caleb, who had seen this happen before, felt his heart stutter with guilt, because there was no escaping once the house had chosen, and later when James tried to leave, loading the truck, stuffing bags into the cab, shouting at Caleb to stay the hell away from his daughter, the engine wouldn't start, and the road out twisted back into itself, no matter how far he drove. And every turn brought them back to the front of the house, where Caleb stood waiting, not with menace but with deep sorrow, because he knew how this ended. And so did the house. And that night, Lucy wandered again, and this time Caleb followed her, watching as she opened doors she shouldn't know existed, descending into places that didn't obey the logic of the house's architecture, spiral staircases that led upward into darkness, doors that opened into vast libraries filled with whispering books, a nursery that reeked of blood and old milk. And at the center of it all, the room behind the basement door, the one bound in rusted chains and iron glyphs. And Lucy stared at it, her hands trembling, and whispered, "She's not just in there. She's in me." And Caleb, horrified, realized what the house had done. It had marked her, perhaps even before she'd arrived, drawn her in not for feeding, but for transformation. And as the door pulsed and moaned like a womb about to birth something unholy, Lucy turned to him and smiled with ancient eyes, eyes that were no longer hers, and said, "We don't need you anymore." And the chains burst from the walls, wrapping around Caleb, dragging him toward the door as it creaked open, revealing not a room but a void, a place of impossible geometry and screaming echoes. And he begged, first her, then the house, then anyone. But his voice was devoured, and the last thing he saw was Lucy stepping inside without fear, her silhouette merging with the darkness. And then the door slammed shut, and the basement fell silent. And upstairs, James slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, dreaming of a house that welcomed him, a place without shadows because the house had taken what it wanted and offered comfort in return. But beneath the floorboards, the walls began to bleed, and in every mirror, Lucy stared back, smiling. The morning after Caleb vanished, James awoke feeling oddly refreshed, his body no longer heavy with dread, and his dreams filled not with screaming corridors or suffocating darkness, but instead with a calm, endless white field where nothing stirred except a figure in the distance, small and unmoving, watching him silently from far away. He remembered little of the dream when he opened his eyes, only the vague sense of being observed, and the persistent echo of a child's whisper he couldn't quite shake. Downstairs, the Wendell house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak of wood and distant tick of an unseen clock. And though James didn't know it yet, the house had entered a new phase of its game, subtle, sinister, patient. And it began with small changes. Mirrors fogged over without cause, electrical outlets hummed like beehives, and objects shifted location even though he hadn't touched them. Lucy, or whatever inhabited her now, pretended well at first, acting like his daughter in voice and manner, calling him Dad and eating toast with jam the way she always had. But James began noticing that she no longer blinked unless she remembered to, and her eyes, once warm and curious, now held an unsettling stillness, like a predator sizing up prey. Once, when he passed by her room late at night, He heard her talking in two voices, one hers and one older, cracked like dry bone. And when he opened the door, she sat alone, smiling in the dark, and said she was just practicing a play for school. James tried to rationalize everything: stress, trauma, lack of sleep. But the facade unraveled quickly when he discovered the strange journal under Lucy's bed, its pages covered in symbols he didn't recognize, glyphs drawn in something too dark and sticky to be ink. And among them were sketches, grotesque, detailed drawings of people bound in chains, mouths sewn shut, eyes replaced by mirrors. And beneath each figure was a name, including his own. James confronted her, shaking with confusion and fear. But Lucy only tilted her head and asked, "Why are you afraid of what you were always meant to become?" And when he slapped the journal onto the kitchen table, demanding an explanation, the pages burst into flame without heat or smoke, turning to ash in seconds. And from that moment on, James stopped pretending he was in control. The house began to close in, its walls seeming to shift subtly when he turned corners, hallways growing longer or shorter as they pleased, doors opening to reveal rooms that weren't there yesterday. A ballroom filled with mannequins wearing his dead wife's dresses, a nursery with a mobile that spun and sang in reverse, a theater where a play was performed by corpses in powdered wigs. And through it all, Lucy watched him, never far, always waiting. He tried leaving again, driving in loops, hiking through the woods, even following the creek until he nearly collapsed from exhaustion. But every path led him back to the same porch, the same front door, and eventually he stopped trying. Instead, he began investigating the house itself, tearing into walls and floorboards in search of anything that could explain the nightmare he was trapped in. And what he found disturbed him more than the dreams. Bones, hundreds of them, buried in crawl spaces, tucked behind beams, infant skulls packed into glass jars hidden behind bookshelves, a staircase that led down into black water filled with teeth instead of fish. And all of it pointed to a long history of rituals, sacrifices, possessions, a lineage of horrors that stretched back centuries, perhaps to when the land was first cursed by something older than language. James realized he was only the latest chapter, a disposable vessel for the house's hunger, and that Lucy, or the thing now wearing her, was the new conduit. The final confirmation came one night when he heard music playing from the attic, a dusty music box melody that clawed at his memory. And when he climbed the stairs, each step moaning beneath his weight, he found the attic lit by candlelight and filled with mirrors. Hundreds of them, arranged in a circle, each reflecting a different version of him. Young, old, bloodied, burned, twisted into inhuman shapes. And at the center stood Lucy in a black dress he had never seen before. Her hands raised as she chanted words that made the air ripple, and when she turned to him, her eyes were entirely black, twin voids sucking in the flickering light, and she said, "You will give yourself freely, or I will take you like the rest." And James ran, stumbling down the stairs, breath ragged, heart hammering. But the house moved with him, closing doors, shifting walls, guiding him back to that same basement door, the one Caleb had been dragged into. And James realized it was a mouth, a gate, a womb that birthed only horror. And as the door creaked open with a wet groan, he saw Caleb inside. Not dead, but suspended in a liquid darkness, eyes wide, mouth gaping in a silent scream, his skin crawling with runes that pulsed like veins. And James fled again, this time not to escape, but to fight. He barricaded himself in the kitchen, carving protective symbols into the floor with a butcher knife, burning sage, reciting every prayer he knew from every religion he'd ever heard of. But the house laughed, a low vibrating sound that made the walls sweat and the ceiling crack. And Lucy appeared in the hallway, no longer hiding behind her girlhood, now a fully formed vessel of something ancient and merciless, her limbs too long, her smile too wide, and her voice no longer hers as she whispered, "She's awake now, and she remembers you." And James screamed, not in fear, but defiance, and lunged at her with the knife, only to find himself frozen mid-motion, paralyzed as invisible hands held him aloft, and the walls peeled back like skin, revealing pulsating organs and twitching nerves beneath the plaster, the house itself alive and eager. He was dragged down the hallway by unseen forces, past rooms that replayed his memories, his wife dying in the hospital, Lucy's birth, the first time he ever told her he loved her, all now tainted by the house's corruption. And when he reached the threshold of the basement, he was dropped to his knees and forced to crawl, the floor beneath him soft and sticky like flesh. And Lucy stood behind him, her voice now dozens layered over one another, saying, "You were never her father. You were always the offering." And as the door closed behind him and the darkness swallowed him whole, James understood that his story was ending, but the house's story was only beginning anew. James awoke not to sunlight, but to a red glow that pulsed like a dying heart, the air thick with the stench of rot and iron, his mouth filled with the taste of rust as he gasped for breath in total darkness. The silence broken only by the wet clicking of something moving just beyond reach. And for a moment he believed he was dead, that the house had finally consumed him and cast him into whatever purgatory it reserved for those who dared to resist. But then the floor beneath him shifted, and he realized he was lying on something not made of wood or stone, but muscle, slick and twitching. And when he reached out blindly, his fingers sank into the moist, warm tissue of a wall that exhaled as if it were alive, breathing in rhythm with something colossal and unseen. He staggered to his feet, the ceiling low enough to scrape his head, and began moving forward, guided only by instinct and the dim red pulses that throbbed from the walls like veins under skin. Each step squelching, the floor swallowing his feet slightly before releasing them with a sickening pop. And all the while the whispers continued, now unmistakably chanting his name, but layered with others, familiar voices, long dead voices, including his wife's, murmuring, "James, James, why did you let us die? And you brought her here." And the guilt, heavier than any spectral hand, wrapped around his chest like chains. Eventually he found a door, or what resembled one, a curtain of flesh stitched together with hair, the handle of bone that pulsed beneath his grip. And when he pulled it open, the whispering stopped and was replaced by screaming, not from a mouth, but from the walls themselves. A sound so loud and low it made his vision blur and his teeth ache. And still he stepped forward, determined now to find Lucy, or the thing inside her, and end this cycle before the house could feed again. What lay beyond was a cathedral of horror, vast and echoing, its ceiling lost in shadows, the floor littered with bones arranged like pews, and at the far end an altar, black and dripping, atop which sat a massive mirror that shimmered not with reflections, but with writhing forms trapped behind the glass. Men, women, children, their mouths open in eternal screams, their hands pressed against the surface as if begging to be let out or to be forgotten. And standing before it was Lucy, no longer pretending, her face half human, half monstrosity, her limbs jointed in unnatural ways, her skin crawling with runes that moved like insects beneath her flesh. She turned as James approached, her smile impossibly wide, and said in a voice like shattering glass, "You came back, just like they all do. It's time to become what you were meant to be." And as she raised her hands, the mirror pulsed and began to bleed, thick black ichor running down its surface and pooling at the altar's base, from which a figure began to rise. Tall, thin, with a face that was not a face but a swirling mass of eyes and mouths, each whispering different truths, each eye blinking in different rhythms, and James fell to his knees, the weight of the entity's presence pressing on him like the deep sea, crushing and endless. And he heard the name in his mind, not spoken but burned, ancient and unpronounceable, a name not meant for human tongues but for rituals long forgotten and forbidden. Lucy beckoned to him, her fingers now long and sharp, bones visible through her stretched skin, and she said, "She is you and you are hers. You were chosen the moment you laid eyes on this place. You brought us here with your grief, your weakness, your need for answers." And James screamed that she was wrong, that he had loved her, that he had come to save her. But the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what she had become and what he now was. a cog in the endless machine of the house, another chapter in its blood-soaked history. And still he fought, lunging at her with a shard of glass he had pulled from the wall, slicing deep into her side, expecting pain or rage. But she only laughed, a sound like 1,000 knives scraping metal, and said, "You think you're the first father who's tried to save their child? This house has eaten better men than you." And with a gesture, she flung him across the room, his body crashing into the pews of bone, several cracking under his weight, his shoulder dislocating with a sickening pop. Crawling through the pain, James noticed something. Symbols carved into the bones, old runes not unlike those in the journal he'd found. But these glowed faintly, as if rejecting the darkness around them. And it dawned on him that maybe the answer wasn't escape or confrontation, but containment. That perhaps the house wasn't just a predator, but a prison, one that had weakened over time and now required hosts like Lucy to maintain it. If he could use the runes, trigger whatever ancient protection they once held, perhaps he could weaken the entity or even trap it again. And so with trembling hands, he began dragging bones into a circle, arranging them according to the patterns he remembered, drawing the missing lines with his own blood when necessary. And as he worked, the cathedral began to tremble, the walls shrieking, the mirror cracking slightly with every completed symbol. Lucy screamed, her voice shaking the floor. "Stop! You'll doom us both!" And James replied, "If it means ending this, I'll gladly burn." And with a final gesture, he placed the largest bone, one carved with a spiral eye, into the center. And the moment it touched the floor, the room exploded with light, not blinding, but pure, burning away the shadows, the whispers, the pulsing flesh of the walls. And the mirror shattered completely, releasing a howl so loud it split the altar in two. The entity screamed as it was dragged backward into the empty frame, its arms flailing, mouth screeching, eyes bleeding, and Lucy screamed with it, her form unraveling like paper in fire. And for 1 second, James saw his daughter again, her real face, eyes full of pain and gratitude, mouthing the words, "Thank you," before she vanished. Then everything went silent, the light gone, the cathedral dissolving around him into ash and wind, and James collapsed, alone, surrounded by nothing but gray dust and the echo of his own breathing. When he awoke again, he was lying on the porch of the Wendell House, the sun rising, birds singing, everything as it was the day they arrived, except the house now looked old again, worn, boarded, abandoned, and Lucy was gone, truly gone. He staggered down the steps, got into his car, and drove until the road changed beneath him, until the trees no longer whispered, until he could no longer see the house in his rearview mirror. And still he drove, unsure of what world he had returned to, if it was ever truly free of the house, if he was. But one thing he knew with certainty: something had been broken, something ancient and monstrous had been pushed back into the void, and as long as he lived, he would ensure no one ever returned to that place, no one ever heard its whispers again. James drove for hours, the morning sun growing stronger, but the weight in his chest did not lighten. The road stretched out endlessly, twisting through dense forests and forgotten towns. But every turn brought a creeping sensation that something was following, watching from the edges of the trees, invisible but palpable, like the cold breath of the Wendell House itself had settled onto his back. He tried to shake the feeling, tried to convince himself that whatever horror had been locked away was truly gone. But when he stopped at a diner, the waitress's eyes flickered with a strange recognition, her smile too sharp, her voice like a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," she said, sliding a cup of black coffee toward him. "They don't like visitors." James looked around, the other customers absorbed in their meals or screens, but the air grew thick, and the flickering of the overhead light cast shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally. And suddenly he understood. The house's curse was not limited to its physical location. It had bled into the world, into the minds of those who dared to cross its path, and it hunted through memories, through fear, feeding on the terror it left behind. As he stepped outside, a chill ran through him as the wind carried a faint, unmistakable whisper. "James." Soft, coaxing, and his heart hammered as he turned to see a figure in the distance. A little girl standing at the edge of the woods, her dress torn, her hair tangled, eyes shining with a light that was not human. She beckoned silently, and James felt the pull, an ache of responsibility and hope mingled with dread. And he stepped forward, but the world around him blurred and twisted. The diner faded, the road disappeared, and he was transported to a place both familiar and alien. The Wendell House, but not as it was, a vision of its past, a time before the darkness took hold, when laughter echoed through its halls, and sunlight warmed the creaking floorboards, and Lucy was alive and whole, playing in the garden with her father, unaware of the fate that awaited them. James reached out to touch the memory, desperate to change it, to save his daughter before the house could claim her. But the moment his fingers brushed the air, the scene shattered like glass, replaced by images of agony. His wife screaming as shadows tore her apart, Lucy crying as the walls closed in, and the house drinking the life from all they loved. And he realized that the Wendell House was no ordinary evil, but a living curse bound by grief, by loss, feeding on the broken hearts of those it trapped. And it rewrote memories to torment its victims, making them relive their worst fears, their deepest regrets over and over again. Shaken, James fell to his knees in the spectral garden, the little girl's ghostly hand resting on his shoulder, her voice barely audible but filled with sorrow. "You can fight it, but it fights back harder. You're its prisoner now, just like me." And in that instant, the air grew cold, and the shadows surged forward, engulfing the vision, and James was pulled back to reality, gasping for air in his car, the forest closing in around him, the trees whispering his name, promising that the house would never truly let him go. But James was no longer the man who arrived helpless and broken. He was determined to uncover the origin of the curse, to find the source that bound the house's evil to this world, and to destroy it once and for all. Days passed as he researched local legends, talked to townsfolk who refused to speak of the house, pieced together a history of sorrow and violence that stretched back centuries, learning of a witch accused of dark magic, burned at the stake on the very land the house now stood, her dying curse entwining her spirit with the soil and the stones, binding her wrath to anyone who dared disturb her rest. With each revelation, the whispers grew louder in his mind. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and dreams of Lucy twisted into nightmares, where she pleaded for release and forgiveness. Yet through the terror, James clung to one hope. If he could find the witch's remains, her heart or relic hidden somewhere beneath the house, he could perform a ritual to sever the curse, to free all souls trapped in its grasp, including his daughters. And as he prepared for the most dangerous journey yet, into the bowels of the Wendell House, into the dark places where even shadows dared not linger, he knew he faced not just a house, but an ancient evil that would consume his very soul if he faltered. But failure was not an option, because the longer the house remained, the more lives it would claim, and James would not let Lucy's light fade into darkness forever. James stood before the crumbling ruins of the old well hidden beneath the overgrown garden behind the Wendell House, the last known place tied to the witch's final moments, a place whispered about in fearful tones by the few elders who dared speak of it. Clutching a tattered journal filled with rituals and warnings, the pages worn and stained with age and desperation. The night was moonless, the sky heavy with clouds that pressed down like a suffocating shroud, and as James descended into the cold darkness of the well, the air grew thick with the scent of decay and burnt wood, his flashlight barely piercing the oppressive gloom, shadows dancing on the jagged stone walls as the wind whispered in voices not his own, promising power, death, and oblivion. He knew the ritual would be perilous, that the witch's spirit would fight to the bitter end, but he had no choice. This was the final battle to sever the curse, to free Lucy's soul and every other trapped in the house's insidious grasp. And as he reached the bottom, a narrow cavern opened before him, walls carved with symbols pulsing faintly with eldritch energy, and in the center lay a small wooden box, blackened with time but bound with iron. The lock rusted but intact, and when James broke it open, he found a heart, not living, but preserved in a strange crystalline substance that shimmered unnaturally in the flashlight's beam. His hands trembling, he pulled it free, feeling a coldness that seeped into his bones, and the cavern suddenly shuddered, the walls groaning as if alive, the air thick with screams and wails from 1,000 voices, some pleading, others furious. James began the incantation from the journal, words that felt alien on his tongue, yet rang with power, the symbols on the walls flaring to life, casting eerie light that flickered like dying embers, and the well shook violently, dust falling, stones crumbling as if the earth itself were tearing apart. From the darkness emerged the witch's spirit, an ethereal figure of smoke and flame, eyes burning with rage and pain, her voice like a chorus of shattered glass, cursing James for disturbing her rest, promising eternal torment. And as she advanced, James held the heart aloft, chanting louder, feeling the artifact's power surge through him like fire and ice entwined. The spirit shrieked, the cavern lighting ablaze with spectral fire, the ground splitting beneath his feet, and for a moment James thought he would be consumed, that the curse would claim him as it had so many before. But he held fast, driven by memories of Lucy's smile, her laughter, the hope she gave him even in the darkest hours. With a final desperate cry, he crushed the heart in his hand, the crystalline shell shattering into shards of light that exploded upward, filling the cavern with blinding brilliance. And the witch's spirit screamed as she was torn apart, the flames dying, the shadows fleeing, until only silence remained, heavy but clean. James stumbled upward, gasping for air as the well's entrance collapsed behind him, burying the evil deep beneath the earth where it belonged. And as dawn broke over the forest, the Wendell House stood silent and empty, its walls cracked and crumbling, no longer pulsing with malevolent life, no longer whispering promises of fear. And though James's body was battered and broken, his soul was free, his burden lifted. And when he finally returned home, he found peace in the stillness, a quiet hope blossoming in his heart that Lucy's spirit was finally at rest, watching over him from beyond the veil. Yet, as he lay in bed that night, the wind rustling softly outside, he could swear he heard a faint whisper on the breeze, not of threat or anger, but of farewell, a gentle voice carrying the promise that love could conquer even the darkest shadows, and that some houses, no matter how haunted, could one day become homes again.